Hi, this is Josh Nichols. I'm an EIR with the LEAP program in the University of Louisville. This document is going to talk about the use of target product profiles in the development of both your product, be it a pharmaceutical, biologic, device, or diagnostic, and the reasons why you'll want to use a TPP. Throughout this document, you'll find small arrows where you can click and get information and hear me narrate each slide and the reasons that you'll want to follow along. So this overview is going to talk about, in general terms, the use of a TPP and what it performs for you in the development of your business plan. Again, covering therapeutics, devices, and diagnostics. I'm then going to dig into specific examples and how you can use the TPPs in the development of your business plan. So in general terms, the reason to develop a TPP include greater understanding of your product's characteristics, its market opportunity and fit, and the ability for you to speak to its need. The TPP can be a living document in the early stages of your product's development, although eventually in time you'll want to have this fixed locked that you can present to other business partners. The TPP also allows you to better understand and articulate dependencies between one product characteristic and perhaps another. For example, in therapeutics, where bioavailability may influence formulation and vice versa. Having an understanding of these dependencies and each of these features and attributes when you go and talk with investors and business partners can give greater confidence to those business partners that, in fact, you are serious and have an understanding of your product's development pathway. Ultimately, this same document can be distilled down into product specifications, whereby the early stages of having fleshed out the attributes of your product can yield things like the components that you select, the types of buffers that you may use, the other specific details of your market opportunity. This is an example of a TPP for a medical device. In the first column, you can enter information about the product description, talk about how the product functions, what it is intended to do. Second, the unmet clinical need, what opportunity is created in the marketplace for your device. Third, the intended use, where the device might be applied. Perhaps it's surgically implanted in an OR, or perhaps it's used at a patient's home bedside. In the fourth box down, you'll be able to discuss freedom to operate and the intellectual property position. This again is something that investors will want to know and will spend a considerable amount of time investigating. Understanding where your product fits and has a position relative to other pieces of intellectual property that may exist in the patent landscape. Below that, this document allows for entry of manufacturability, discussion about how the device is manufactured perhaps in your own facility, or will be completely outsourced and manufactured apart from where you conduct business. Below that is a required reference standards list. These are the industry standards, perhaps ISO, that are referenced and required by the FDA to adhere to during manufacturing of your device. Comparative devices below that. This is just a simple listing of other devices that you think are addressing the same space that your product will enter. Device functional specifications, things that include dosage and administration of what your product is intended to be relative to the competition. Human factors consideration. Will a patient have to hold it? What will it look like? How will they interact with the design? Why might it be colored? Why might it not be colored? Dimensional requirements. This is really critical when you think about indwelling implants. How large should it be? Where is it going to be implanted? Does it need to have a certain shape or a certain size relative to the ideal need? And then lastly, material requirements. And these are things that you'll have to talk about and think about in terms of biocompatibility, whether they're suitable for implantation, whether they're suitable for skin contacting, or if the patient isn't going to necessarily be contacting the device at all. In the next section is performance requirements. This can be physical requirements, it might be electrical component requirements, it may be functional therapeutic requirements. It's really specific to what your device and product is. Below that is environmental issues related to the design, things that you might need to take in consideration given where the therapy or the device may be used. Device safety. Ultimately, you'll be at least as safe as your nearest competitor, if not more so. You can talk about that here. Packaging requirements. Does the device need to be sterile? Can it be delivered just in a clean manner? Labeling. Labeling for use. Labeling for precautions that a care provider or a patient may need to take. Regulatory requirements. The anticipated pathway for clearance or approval by the FDA. You can talk about that here, and some basic understanding is going to be required. Preclinical testing. Things that you may need to do to determine the safety of your device or the efficacy of your device in a preclinical model, and some mention of what exactly that model might be would be extremely helpful. And then ultimately clinical studies, the pathway that you're taking to build clinical evidence that will ultimately allow the FDA and people who will pay for your device to be confident that your device in fact does and delivers better than your target competitor. This template is used for developing a diagnostic TPP. In the first box, you can enter product description, what the product does, if it is a ELISA assay, if it is a PCR-based assay, if it's some other type of diagnostic test used in the clinic. Second box below that is unmet clinical need, where you see the opportunity for your product to ultimately deliver upon a better treatment experience for the patient. Third below that is intended use. This may be a laboratory, it may be a CLIA lab, it may be patient bedside, it could be a physician's office, where ultimately the test is performed. Freedom to operate an IP position the same as before. Having an understanding of the intellectual property landscape is going to be essential for both your partners and for your investors. Manufacturability. This will consider what goes into developing your tests, the assays, the buffers, the test article and test reagents that are required to conduct the test. Comparative diagnostic and reference methods. So for every good test, there's a positive and negative control, and understanding how you can measure your outcome relative to known standards is going to be essential. Assay interpretation. What ultimately is required for this assay to be performed? Does it need a PCR machine? Does it require real time? Does it have a lateral flow assay component that is required as well? Performance requirements. So these may be general terms such as speed. Perhaps it is environmental considerations whereby your improved assay works better outside of a rigorously controlled laboratory, and that is something that is a significant advantage to your diagnostic. Human factor consideration. This may be the way that the reagents are added. It could be the way that the assay is interpreted. Single analyte or multiplexed. You may be developing an assay that targets a single specific mutation as relevant to a particular disease state. Or perhaps it looks at a multiplexed array of different analytes that the interpretation of which give an outcome. And you'll want to talk about what exactly your test is doing below that. CLIA waiver. So obviously CLIA laboratories have the ability to create and run their own lab developed tests, or LDTs. CLIA waiver would say that the company, your company, has already established that the test can be performed outside of a CLIA laboratory, and you want to discuss how that is going to be conducted at this point. And then ultimately packaging, taking into consideration things like, does it need to be refrigerated? Is it shelf stable? How long would it be shelf stable? And the things that would be required for you to conduct the test once it's taken out of the packaging. In this final section of the diagnostic TPP, you'll want to talk about labeling, things that you'll need to have in terms of components, measurements of the results, perhaps the equipment that will be required to run the assay. Non-clinical testing below that then is what you'll be doing to validate the assay. What the things you will employ will be as test articles and how you will establish their accuracy relative to unknowns. And then lastly, clinical studies that may be required. In the case of a new PMA or 510K cleared assay, you may very well need to run a clinical study, perhaps prospective, talking about what size you anticipate, how many patients, things of that nature that will be required for actually performing the clinical study. In the development of a therapeutic TPP, you'll follow a similar methodology as with both diagnostic and device TPPs. Starting with the product name, product description, the unmet clinical need, what you see in the marketplace as an opportunity, indication, what the target disease or manifestation of a disease that you're going after may be. Comparative therapeutics, a brief discussion of other drugs or other biologics that might be focused on the same clinical indication. Mechanism of action, if there's an understanding that's clearly around perhaps changes to a kinase function or changes within transcriptional regulation, these are things that you want to talk about in MOA. Clinical pharmacology, discussing the pharmacokinetics, the pharmacodynamics, and then pathways that would be affected by the use of your therapeutic. And then target metrics, talking about small molecule targets, things that are around druggability, novelty, validation, potential mechanism based toxicity. And then for antibody targets, how that antibody will function. Is it going to be a naked antibody? Will it somehow have a different moiety that is attached, conferring some sort of functional benefit to the use of that antibody as a therapeutic? So continuing on in therapeutic TPP, you want to talk about your freedom to operate within the space of your development. That may be the design of an aptamer, it may be the family and class of small molecules, it may be the development of an antibody and its intended use. Underneath that, manufacturability, how you intend to develop your therapeutic. Beyond that, the development candidate potency, how you measure potency in terms of some functional outcome related to the application of your therapeutic in a representative assay. It could be an animal model or a cell-based model or a biochemical assay. Development candidate specificity, how you define off-target or target specificity of your therapeutic and its potential effect. Biocompatibility, you want to also discuss ADME PK properties, so absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of your small molecule or your therapeutic, where it ends up, what it does, on and off rate if that's known, solubility, and then stability. And then safety and toxicity. You'll have to talk about here what you will ultimately try to either incorporate or exclude, and how you'll perform that safety and toxicity testing along the way in the development. In the final section of your therapeutic TPP, you'll want to talk about primary efficacy endpoints. Whatever it is that your therapeutic is doing, how you're going to measure in a clinical setting what its functional outcome is. Similar to that, secondary efficacy endpoints, this may be in fact off target. It may be when you're looking at a cardiovascular outcome, it may be something related to respiratory effects or benefits. And then dosage and administration, depending upon the characteristics of your therapeutic, how you intend to dose, and administer your drug is going to be pretty critical to discuss. Contraindications: when you understand the MOA or perhaps the off-target effects, what you may need to avoid. Packaging and labeling, talking about how you anticipate storage and ultimately what will have to be labeled by the FDA for the use of your particular therapeutic. Preclinical testing and clinical studies, again, you're going to want to go through and talk about the tests that are going to be required to demonstrate efficacy and safety in both preclinicals and then clinical studies. So in this final slide, I wanted to bring this back to the very beginning and where we started from, and that is the TPP really becomes an outline for you to better understand and articulate your business plan or your business pitch. There's some things you obviously won't be talking about, but will certainly be touched upon the things you incorporate into the TPP. So, for example, starting from a pretty basic business plan outline, talking about the company purpose, your company is going to develop one of these 3 types of medical products. You'll be addressing a problem, and you'll have to pretty clearly identify that problem and then talk about it and how you are a solution that is uniquely positioned to address that problem. Why now? You'll talk about, within the context of the TPP, perhaps advantages in recent changes and recent discoveries that have enabled you to create your medical product. And then you'll want to, of course, in that TPP, talk directly about market size and competition. Your product and all of its features will as well be outlined in the TPP, and then the rest are really just additional components to help you frame your business pitch or business plan. And so, I hope that you've taken away from this that the TPP is a really essential component of developing your business plan and business pitch, and helps teams and collaborators better understand how to develop the product that you're seeking to ultimately deliver to the market and commercialize. Thank you for your time.